become on their precedents in politics and policy, and so it is very timely that we be able to meet things, listen to two panels of experts on issues ranging from privacy to competition policy to the future of AI, and we're delighted at the American Action Forum to have a chance to have this event. I want to thank in advance Rob Hagemann, for agreeing to moderate the first panel. Rob is with the Office of Finance, spent a long time at the Washington Post and contributed to my favorite, Boing Boing. And thank you for your contribution today and look forward to the panel.
All right, thank you all for showing up. And we just knew the magic phrase lunch will be provided to the work to get your attendance. So I thought I'd start this on a very down-to-earth basis. What is the actual problem with privacy we're trying to solve here?
Well, I think in a lot of cases that's a very personal question, and one of the great benefits of the more permissionless approach we've had in the US is that it's allowed consumers to make those choices. Right now, one of the driving factors behind privacy policy is both the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that went into effect in Europe last May, that has required American companies to spend millions in compliance and in some cases resulted in smaller players pulling out, and the California Consumer Privacy Act that will go into effect in January 2020. As a result, we kind of have these two elephants in the room driving the conversation about, do we need these acts adopted on a federal level, or do we need a state-by-state cases, which could lead to a real patchwork problem, or are we doing the right thing and staying the course with the permissionless approach and allowing the market to respond to these?
Yeah, I would add, I think that it's clear that, to me, like if we don't know what the problem is, it's hard to get to a solution. But we can sort of work backwards. And if you look at privacy in particular, there's a really wide range of disagreement over what the world should look like at the end of a good privacy law. There are some people who really think that there are certain business models that just shouldn't exist. And there are other people who think that those same business models have been useful and good for consumers. That's in contrast, the privacy debate I think is a little bit in contrast to the data security debate, where even though people disagree on how to get to the solution, they do tend to agree on what they think the world should look like after effective data security practices. And that's a world in which there's fewer data breaches. And so I think that right there suggests that there are some areas in which Congress can find agreement where we do agree on what the problems are. These are things that the FTC has long been addressing, things like financial injury, things like healthcare information, even children's information, areas of sensitive data, healthcare information, areas of sensitive data where Congress has acted in the past and the FTC has focused on those areas. But when we start talking about other types of information, other types of injury, I think that's where the debate about what the problem is gets really complicated. And I think that just basically comes down to people don't agree on what the world should look like at the end of good privacy law.
Yeah, I think getting back to the original question Rob asked, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? It's very difficult to suss through that because I think every single person has a different idea of what the problem actually is based on their own personal experiences. We all define privacy differently. We all have different risk thresholds and tolerances for how much private information we're going to put out there. And so it's very difficult to pin down what exactly sort of like the broad societal level problem is. And if you want a perfect example of this, some people may recall the Equifax breach. Some people might not even remember it anymore, despite the fact that
I got Equifax, I remember that.
Okay, yeah, okay. One person does. At the time, it was huge. It was one of the biggest data breaches in American history. I think it was the biggest at the time, and yet it faded very quickly from memory. And I think part of the explanation for why it did was because there was no clear identifiable harm to individuals. In a broad sense. Some people probably did suffer identity theft, but there's no clear indication that there was a greater surge in identity theft or financial harms than there was previously. And so nowadays, when we're inundated by this constant deluge of privacy or purported privacy concerns surrounding big tech companies, they're doing this with your information, they're doing that with your information. Cambridge Analytica scandal, 50 million different 50 million users who were breached in a way. Not quite a breach, but we can get into that in more detail. But the problem here generally, I think, is a sense that something is wrong and something should be different, despite the fact that it's very difficult for us to pinpoint those specific localized harms in individuals.
I might just tag on that to a little bit. On another panel that I was on about privacy legislation, within the first 5 minutes, we had talked about identity theft. We had talked about misinformation campaigns. We had talked about election manipulation. We talked about targeted advertising. Those are all radically different problems. They all somehow sort of involve the big tech companies. And so I think part of the challenge here is that the privacy discussion has always been complicated, but now everybody is lumping basically all their concerns about tech into the privacy bucket. If they're looking for a privacy law to solve all of those problems, that's going to be very challenging.
The phrase I find myself coming back to is no surprises. Like, you should have some sense of what kind of data of yours is being collected, what's being done with it, how long it's kept. I'll give you one example of how right now we are surprised. I came with a tracking device, so did all of you. Obviously, T-Mobile needs to know where this thing is or it will have no service. How long do they keep that cell site location information? Their transparency report does not say. Their privacy policy does not say. So I asked the PR department, perhaps they will say. And I checked with the other carriers, they don't say either. So maybe one of them does better at that than the other. Maybe you'd like to know that as an informed customer. You don't, they're not telling. Another example, I assume most of us have the Facebook app on our phones. There's always this, I call it a legend going around, that it's listening to you in the background. I am 99% sure that's not the case because they would be a world of hurt. But people keep saying that, including a friend of mine who's been a former chief marketing officer for 2 different companies. Facebook's defense is, no, our ads are so amazingly specific because their web tracking is so good. And that's supposed to be a defense. It only looks like we're snooping on you in the background, but actually we're just following you around the web. And again, people don't know how this stuff works. They don't know if they can stop it. It's just a lot of black boxes that push creepily accurate ads in front of people, unless they're completely inaccurate, in which case people wonder, why is this whole thing so broken?
Yeah, I mean, I love how you ended that there, because I would caveat your principle. I think most people don't want any unpleasant surprises, right? They love to be surprised when it works amazingly and they didn't even know that service was there. And so it's the same data that provides those types of amazing surprises, risks for some people having a negative surprise. And we need to think about the trade-offs between those two. If you eliminate all surprises, you're going to eliminate the good surprises too.
And to pick up on 2 things there as well, the creepiness factor is different for everyone. Where you draw the line of creepiness, where I draw the line of creepiness, and where Neil draws the line of creepiness, is going to be quite a different spectrum. And trying to regulate creepiness as opposed to actual harm is going to result in much more significant trade-offs, both in terms of innovation and even in terms of free speech issues potentially. And to your point about trying to be an educated consumer, I think that is something that we really need to ensure is going on in these debates, is that we're empowering consumers to take those steps themselves. And I think a lot more consumers are aware, just because of the conversations going on, to check their privacy settings, to check whether they've been compromised in a data breach, and then they can make the choice of how they want to make any changes as a result of that.
So we've talked about the GDPR. Let's unpack that law a little bit. It went into effect last May, as many of you may remember from getting 6 million email notices asking that if you want to stay on this mailing list or not. It spans about 55,000 words. I can't say I've read all of it, but I have at least skimmed it in all the relevant parts. Are there parts of that would be worth importing, as I've seen even some Republican Congress people suggest we do? And what parts of it should we, under no circumstances, flood across the Atlantic?
So, again, I feel like, and this is pretty common, jumping to solutions when we haven't figured out what the problem is. It depends. The interesting thing about GDPR is that it doesn't actually use the word privacy anywhere. It's around regulation of data, and so the goal that they're aiming at is not. It's somewhat different, and it's in a different context than the U.S. Probably the biggest legal substantive difference is that they don't have the First Amendment. And when you are putting restrictions on what other people can do with information, you can quickly run up against First Amendment restrictions. And so I think the approach that the GDPR took in some ways is like a magnified version of some of the best practices that the U.S. The Federal Trade Commission has encouraged. For example, notice and consent. All of those check up all those boxes that you saw. Reasonable security. Those are all things that the U.S. has adopted as best practices, and that the FTC has brought enforcement actions after there's been consumer injury, but it hasn't laid out in like deep detail ahead of time exactly what a company has to do. And that has pluses and minuses, but its big plus is that it allows companies to try something new that the regulators couldn't have contemplated. And so to the extent that we bring ideas from GDPR, I think we really need to focus on finding the ones that target the specific problems we're worried about, whether that be identity theft or financial fraud or something else, and leave behind the stuff that tries to micromanage how companies handle it.
And I think to Neil's point about one of the advantages of the American approach has been this flexibility that has really allowed American innovation to take off. We can't necessarily imagine what the next technology is going to look like. If we'd been on this panel 10 years ago, we would have been talking about MySpace and Yahoo and AOL.
Hey, Yahoo's still around.
More than we're talking about today's current, and they've shifted though, and I think that's important too, is that these technologies change and shift, and even what our current giants look like may change as well. In terms of GDPR though, it's also important to remember that we've seen some real consequences already in terms of companies exiting the market, in terms of companies that have looked at those compliance costs or looked at what they might have to change and decided that it's not worth it to continue the business model, particularly given some of the uncertainty and some of the potentially crushing liability if things go wrong.
Just to kind of go on what Neil and Jennifer were talking about, I think it's also worth keeping in mind that GDPR didn't just come out of nowhere, right? I mean, this is a very unique European approach to how we handle data protection and privacy issues, how they handle those issues. But the EU for the last 25 years or so, actually more like 30, 35, has taken a much different approach to how they deal with data protection and digital commerce. It has always been prioritizing privacy over everything else. And that comes from a unique historical experience they've had, especially some of the Eastern Europeans living under Soviet rule.
If you go to Berlin and visit the Stasi Museum,
I was just talking about that. Yeah,
why they have a different attitude about privacy.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable when you actually go to visit the archives, because they have sort of old index punch cards in which they actually keep track of literally every single person in the city, who's an informant, who they're informing on, who's informing on the informers, and it's just this massive warehouse of index and punch cards. And you think to yourself as a European perhaps, wow, if only Stasi had the power of the digital age, imagine all of the harm that they could have done. So Europe is approaching this from a unique historical perspective that we haven't actually had in this country. And going off what Jennifer sort of alluded to, one of the other things that's worth noting here is, as a result of the approach that the Europeans have taken, they have no digital economy to speak of. The total market value, market capitalization of major tech companies in this country is over $5 trillion. In Europe, it's closer to about $265, $275 billion. That means the entire European digital economy is about as valuable as the Intel Corporation. And so when we're talking about different approaches to how we treat privacy, it's worth bearing in mind that these are not costless approaches. They have trade-offs associated with them. that those trade-offs are jobs, those trade-offs are economic growth, those trade-offs are innovation possibilities. So just worth bearing in mind that when people talk about privacy as a value we need to protect, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. It's just a question of how we make the trade-off.
And I think to continue what Ryan was saying, it's not just a question of how we make the trade-offs, it's who gets to make those trade-offs. Should these be trade-offs that individual consumers are making, or are there cases where these trade-offs need to be a broader societal decision that comes from a government deciding to make the trade-offs instead of the consumer?
And one thing I'd add from my experience working at the Federal Trade Commission is that the approach to enforcement is also really different between the US and Europe. Europe often passes laws that they will admit and they will say are essentially aspirational. So they're very complicated. They aim like the highest standard possible, and the regulator knows for a fact that companies are going to have difficulty complying with it. The main goal is to get the companies to come in and talk to the regulator, right? And that's just very different than the U.S. approach. Here, you know, the Federal Trade Commission is the most active privacy enforcer in the world, and if you had something, if you just cut and paste GDPR into the U.S. with our with our independent agencies who bring enforcement cases and then our private litigation practices, it would look really different in its effect on businesses. It would be much more onerous than it is in Europe. And so, so cutting and pasting is a very complicated thing when you're moving between two different jurisdictions.
Let's turn our attention now from Brussels to Sacramento. The California Consumer Privacy Act is mentioned. Very comprehensive bill modeled in large part after the GDPR. It's not in effect yet. It will go into effect 2020, which makes this an interesting year to be in Washington when there are a lot of privacy bills floated around. As in most years, there's more urgency because a lot of people in technology do not want to see a huge chunk of the U.S. economy subject to this distinct set of rules. In the CCPA, anything that is working with keeping in the national standard, and then you don't want to see in the national standard.
One of the interesting things is that we're seeing states act on this at all, and California is the only one that has actually passed a bill, but we have bills in states as varied as Washington State and North Dakota that have been proposed. The problem with this approach is that we could end up with this patchwork framework where either companies have to choose very specifically the states they're going to work in. The state with the most restrictive approach ends up becoming the de facto national regulator, or the largest states like California, get the greatest say if there is no federal preemption. Now, there are a lot of concerns about, are there other ways to potentially challenge these bills, be it through the Dormant Commerce Clause or the First Amendment or various other things having to do with specific provisions. But in the meantime, companies are going to have to be preparing as if they're going into effect unless there is some kind of movement on federal preemption in the meantime. One of the things that I think is particularly concerning in the California bill is the private right of action, or what has potentially been considered as a private right of action because of the large litigation burden that could place on quite a few companies, and the fact that you then have a kind of shift in the nature of liability in this issue.
I would say, you know, the process, in comparison to the GDPR process, which came out of a previous long debate in Europe, and then GDPR itself was the process, the end result of a really long process. CCPA was not like that. It was much faster. In fact, when it moved to bill form, I think it was adopted in the California legislature.
They were trying to get ahead of a referendum, right?
So yeah, they had a deadline and they moved it really fast, and everybody knew that it was going to have to be fixed. In that situation, it's no surprise that there are a lot of problems in it. I think one of the things, some of the goals are admirable. For example, it tries to minimize the impact on small businesses, but it draws the threshold really low. So that probably sweeps in, you know, if your dry cleaner has a website, there's a shot that they have to comply with CCPA. It doesn't apply to nonprofits, which is strange because nonprofits collect tons of data in part so that they can find donors. One thing it does that's good, although it's being argued right now, is that it excludes publicly available information from the definition of sensitive information, and that's probably smart. I mean, it'd be very complicated if all of a sudden things that you could find publicly on a government website, a company wasn't allowed to also rely on that information as well. So there are some good things about it, and I think some of the goals are quite admirable. I think the approach they took is a result of a fast process that didn't get a lot of stakeholders on board, and I think would be a bad model for process and adopting privacy law.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go a little bit further and say that it should be killed with fire many times over. The process was, I think, representative of everything that makes referendums a non-ideal means of crafting policy. Now, Neil's right, they did exclude publicly available information from the definition of sensitive information, and yet the definition is still so broad. It actually includes olfactory information. So any smell that you happen to waft coming off of another individual is technically protected information. And I think it's representative of what a lot of the folks in the privacy advocacy community actually want to see in a privacy bill, which is we're not confining it simply to the digital realm. We have to broaden it to everything. It has to touch every business, and it has to touch every business in every industry, because everyone is collecting some type of information about individuals, and that's a problem. Now, again, going back to the original question, why, what is the problem? It's going to differ by person, right? So, my personal sense is that it's not quite the problem that many individuals and organizations make it out to be, but I understand where they're coming from. The question is whether or not a bill like this is going to achieve the stated aims and ends of those various individuals. The other thing I would point out, perhaps for me, one of the most problematic provisions of the CCPA is basically the free rider provision, right? So if you are an online service provider, if you're Facebook and you're offering service in a contract with users that they freely consent to, and you are collecting private information from them for the use of that service, you cannot provide a degraded variation of that service for individuals who choose to opt out of providing their information, which means you're essentially codifying in law a specific type of business model that online service providers need to abide by. So you have to offer two tracks. You have to make it available to either everyone for a cost, or you need to make it available to some for a cost, and others who are willing to trade their private information, you have to make it available for free. That's problematic for way too many reasons that I can get into in like the next 30 seconds. But the idea that some users should be forcibly mandated by law to subsidize other users, I think, puts us on a very slippery slope to basically undercutting many of the basic economic foundations of the digital economy, not just in this country, but globally.
So let me follow up on that issue of free rider issues, because I think we sort of have it already. I'm looking at this iPad in front of me. The Safari browser on it is set to block Facebook's tracking across the entire web. Like a site that uses Facebook comments, like my client USA Today, I have to tap the registered dialog to use them at all, and then Facebook can see what I do on USA Today. So don't we already sort of have that when people adopt various technological self-help measures, whether it's using a privacy-preserving browser like Safari or Firefox, running an ad blocker, plugin like Ghostery?
Yeah, well, obviously,
we learn from that, from what people have done so far.
well, I think what you could learn from that is that some people want to be able to use these tools, and they have every right to try to use them. I think that makes a ton of sense for individuals to try to control the information how they're interacting with the internet. Now, on the flip side, the difference is we don't have a law that says if you use Ghostery, then New York Times can't block you from accessing their site, even if you're not helping fund the content that you're reading. And so that would be a problem. So while we have self-help, there can be self-help on both sides. And you've seen this sort of in the escalating battles around ad blockers, and that's healthy. I mean, that is a signal both to the content provider and to the platforms of what some consumers want. And it's also a signal to smart people out there about how they can help consumers who want to protect privacy using technical tools to do it. I think that's good, that's great, that's called competition. The problem is when you start mandating certain levels of that into law, and when you remove the economic incentives for those to even exist in the first place. So ghostery would be, if you applied CCPA across the world, ghostery wouldn't have a reason to exist, right? Because I could just block, and I wouldn't need that. So that company would have a problem.
So because of the CCPA's taking timeline, there are a lot of bills getting floated around, both from House and Senate offices and from various interest groups. Are there any out there, or parts of any that you would like to see part of any national legislation?
Well, I can't really comment on any specific bill or legislation, but big picture principles, I like bills that focus on enforcement, where enforcement is triggered on consumer injury. There are some people thinking about how to do that in ways that look sort of FTC-like, but in other ways as well. And so I think those types of approaches that focus on what is the injury and bringing an ex post action better allow people to try new things than ones that try to set out all the rules ahead of time. Also, rules that focus on uses that are harmful rather than on collection. We have a lot of focus on collection because it seems like the obvious place to look, but it's much harder to tell, again, because of the surprises that can occur, whether or not a specific type of information outside of the ones that we've already talked about, healthcare information, financial information, real-time geolocation information.
Kids information.
Yeah, stuff that the FTC has looked at for a long time. But outside of those categories where the risk is, we kind of all agree that the risk can be heightened in those situations. Other types of information, there could be huge benefits to that, but possibly also it could be misused. And it's hard to tell that ex ante. And so especially for those types of information, I think it makes a lot more sense to focus on what use do we have a problem with that information. And that's something that Congress did under the Fair Credit Reporting Act that takes this sort of approach. It doesn't restrict the collection that can occur, but it does say you can't use this information to deny somebody a job without telling them that there was an adverse decision based on that information. So, setting rules around the harms that could happen to consumers and having an agency enforce, I think, makes a ton more sense.
So building off of what Neil said, I think it's important to point out that the FTC does have experience in addressing ex post, particularly these different harms, and that the ex post approach has worked in a lot of cases in terms of identifying those potentially bad actors and remedying the situation. Ex ante, it's much more difficult to predict how a lot of these technologies will evolve, and we run the risk that we could lose innovations because of how the rules were constructed, that someone can't think of the next great thing. At the same time, when we're talking on a federal level, with the number of states that we have taking different actions, I think that we're getting increasingly to a point where some kind of federal preemption is necessary to prevent a patchwork problem, particularly with the internet, where the internet doesn't obey state borders. It barely obeys international borders, let alone trying to have a little startup complying with 50 different rules.
So let's talk about the Federal Trade Commission's role so far. The way it works right now, I'm going to simplify a little bit. If it sees deceptive or unfair conduct, it can bring an investigation, and usually what results is a settlement agreement like the one negotiated with Facebook in 2011, where there may be some fine assessed, but the real pain can't happen until the company that signed this deal breaks the rules a second time. And now we're seeing what might happen with Facebook, with Cambridge Analytica, all these other cases we've heard about, where it could be a fine with in the billions instead of the millions, although when you make Facebook money, even billions might not be that much. There are some people who want to see the FTC force Facebook, give them a choice, either pay some extreme amount of money or spin off Instagram or WhatsApp. Do we think the FTC, what have we learned from this attempt so far to impose these conditions and settlements after the fact?
You did a good job of summarizing the FTC's enforcement approach. I would say on the lead end of all of that, there's a lot of work that the FTC puts into providing guidance out there. And if you ask any privacy attorney, they'll tell you, like, I spend a lot of time telling my clients don't do X or Y because of this case that was brought. So it does have a forward-looking effect, enforcement does. I would say if consumers are injured, the FTC can get redress for consumers in the first instance. They don't have to wait until the second violation. So, so while it's not fining authority, they do have redress authority in many cases.
Is the Vizio viewing tracking case, the smart TV case, is that resulting in money to consumers? Sorry, I keep wanting to say customers.
Yeah.
If you're a consumer, your job is to consume. If you're the customer, you're always right.
Or user.
I hate that too. Let's try to say customer, not consumer.
So I don't remember the specifics of the Vizio case. I think there, the allegation was that there was, the opt-in was unclear.
It was a real dark pattern where you would be setting up your new smart TV and there would be a dialogue you'd see for like 15 seconds. And if you just press the biggest button on the screen or on the remote, you would then have your viewing tracked and aggregate.
And the question there around the deceptive practice was whether or not they had promised something and gave the impression that they were doing something that they weren't doing. There, the harm would be I guess the alternative between buying TVs if you didn't know in an economic sense. But I don't think the FTC dug into that. I think the settlement, as if I'm recalling correctly, did not include refunds to consumers. It certainly included a penalty to the company.
Yes.
It wasn't a penalty from the FTC, but it was a pretty big stock hit and a reputation hit. And going forward, I think you're right, though, that the fining ability in the second instance of a violation, where you have a person who is specifically promised to take a certain set of actions to the commission, and that doesn't, the fining authority there can be a pretty big deterrent.
And one of the other advantages of the FTC approach is this focus on consumer welfare, that we are looking for cases where consumers have actually been harmed or where there is a real potential for harm, and as a result, it's going to be more narrowly tailored and allowing that kind of market to evolve that provides a wider array of solutions for consumer preferences.
Are there any, beyond Facebook, are there any other FTC cases we should be watching to see, if this shows a sort of heightened degree of scrutiny for tech privacy issues?
Well, when I was at the FTC, I wasn't allowed to talk about ongoing investigations, and now I don't even know about them. So I can't really say much on that. I would say the FTC did just come out this week with its summary of all of its privacy actions for 2018. When I was at the commission, I waited for that every year because it was the thing that I used to pull stats from. So if you're interested in what the FTC did in 2018, that's a resource that's out there right now, and it covers a wide range of privacy cases and data security cases that I think it's good to remind ourselves that there is somebody doing something out there.
Yeah, the case I'm thinking of was the $5.7 million fine of TikTok for violating the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which I found funny in a sarcastic sense, since any tech company should know not to get into a COPPA situation, because there was an entire Silicon Valley episode about that on HBO, which was screamingly funny.
It is funny,
and yet
it is very funny. But I'll tell you about COPPA. COPPA is a great example of the types of cases that the FTC can bring where there doesn't have to be an order violation in order for the FTC to impose a fine, because COPPA, in that instance, Congress said specifically, if you violate COPPA, the FTC can impose a fine, and it did in the TikTok case. COPPA isn't a perfect law either, and if you look at the ecosystem for children's apps, it's very difficult business. For the exact reason that the Silicon Valley episode demonstrates. And so there is some sense that we probably have less innovation in apps that are useful to children and that are specific for children uses because of COPPA. Now that trade-off might make sense, and Congress has decided
an
that
8-year-old, I'm not sure we need to disrupt that space too much.
Congress obviously decided that it didn't make sense, and so so that's the sort of thing, though, that I think it makes a ton of sense to focus on. Like, what is the specific vertical of injury or likely injury to injury, and do something specific to that.
Well, and I would also point to COPPA as another example of when we have identified that there are particularly vulnerable groups or particularly sensitive information, we have seen carve-outs more narrowly tailored to address those harms or those particular vulnerabilities, as opposed to kind of a wide-scale legislation that would potentially have more repercussions on innovation.
Now, a lot of discussions about privacy policy have assumed that Congress is going to do something. They have to because CCPA is going to go into effect. But the legislative branches, how long have we had a patchwork of data breach disclosure laws across the states? How long has everyone involved said we need a federal standard? Nothing's happened on that. So realistically, what do you think the odds are that actually nothing happens between now and the end of the year? And we can, I guess, further balkanize privacy regulations state by state.
I'll put a stake in the ground and say 50-50 coin flip. Because on the one hand, you know, federal government really is in a position because of CCPA where it kind of has to preempt the law, or it should, ideally. On the other hand, I think a lot of people in the privacy advocacy community still look at federal preemption being included in any bill as a possible poison pill, especially if the other provisions
of fear of regulatory capture, yes.
Yeah, and especially because whatever provisions may end up in the bill could be functionally less effective than they would like them to be, right? So sort of watered down authorities or some such. So the stalking horse of federal preemption potentially being a poison pill, from the perspective of some, I think, really casts doubt on the viability of us getting a package that all sides can agree to. On the other hand, folks on what I would lovingly term my side of the debate, I think a lot of us are a little concerned about various mandatory opt-in provisions into any federal bill, and other things as well. But we have these two sort of competing issue spaces where I don't think everyone's going to get everything they want, but I think there are some marginal issues that if they aren't included in the bill, effectively render one side of the debate an absolute no, or another side of the debate an absolute no. Though at the end of the day, I think the monkey that's ultimately going to be throwing a wrench into this machine is probably just going to be Congress, if that's everyone. But the actual political horse trading that needs to go on here, I think, is not a salient enough issue in many people's minds, despite the fact that it is headline news. And because of the number of pieces of legislation out there, it's not clear to me that all sides get to agreement on a specific set of anything more than broad principles. And that, I think, ultimately ends up being a no-go for certain folks in the privacy advocacy community. So 50-50.
I'd say there's a lot of people in this room who have a lot better knowledge on what's likely for Congress than I do. I think I was on record at the State of the Net event as saying 10%, but I'm rethinking that a little bit, and here's why. I do think that there is common ground that people can find on the types of harms that matter to consumers, and that Congress could do something on. Whether that something looks like beefing up FTC enforcement ability or something, I think there is some common ground to be found. My concern, and the reason I think I went with 10% early on, is that I think there's a good chunk of people who care less about solving that problem than they do about punishing big tech companies. And if that's the goal, I think it's going to be hard to find common ground. And so if Congress gets together and thinks through what harms are we trying to address, how can we make sure this bill actually makes consumers' lives better, I think there's a good shot. I think if the goal is just to punish big tech companies, it's going to be much harder to find a path forward.
And, not to get ahead of the next panel, but just riffing on Neil's point there, and some of the points made earlier, I think for a lot of people, the privacy issue is sort of this this empty policy vessel to be filled with sort of their wish list of things that they'd like to get done, and this is the means by which to do it. And I think privacy could potentially actually also be a vessel to be filled with competition and antitrust policy issues, right? I mean, so Senator Warren's recent proposal to break up big tech, I think a lot of the fuel on the fire that's burning there is privacy related. So, just bear in mind, privacy and antitrust tools are not the means by which we achieve all our ideal political ends, right? I mean, it's tough, but we have to do those in a more piecemeal fashion, otherwise we risk a lot, an awful lot.
Well, and to kind of build off of what Ryan just said, I don't know that I can put an exact percentage on it because some of it depends on, are we talking about a bill that would just address privacy, or are we talking about kind of a broader internet regulating behemoth that addresses all this laundry list of different concerns that people have had?
Rewrite the Telecom Act, the communications, CDA 230, everything else.
Everything else all into one. I think the other interesting question is what happens if we don't get a bill? Are there roles for soft law in this space? Are we just looking at a 50-state patchwork? How do all of these different agencies kind of come together in terms of this vacuum that could potentially exist?
See, I'm not super optimistic either, since the last time Congress did swiftly act on privacy was to vote to cancel pending Federal Communications Commission's rules on what broadband providers would do with their information. That was a very quick vote in 2017. So my next question is actually just ask a version of it. While Congress is doing congressional things, is there a role for sort of public pressure of one sort or another to get the bigger tech companies to take less of it, tell more and what they're doing with it? Let us control how that use is done. Practice data minimization instead of collect all the user's information until the server is full.
I'm going to go slightly afield here and say no. And I think the answer is no, not because most people don't in the abstract care about privacy, but in terms of the practical effects of what information is being gathered about them. I don't think that is a primary pressing concern for most people these days. Most people have probably about 24 other broad policy concerns in their mind that come before, what information am I willingly giving up to use Facebook and Google for free. So, when we talk about public pressure, I think we need to define what we actually mean by public pressure. We're not talking about a groundswell of grassroots opposition to big tech companies. I mean, despite the public relations fights and nightmare, frankly, that Facebook has been experiencing over the last couple of years at this point, Facebook and the other tech companies are still widely regarded as, good companies by the vast majority of Americans.
I'm not so sure about Facebook these days.
Well, they're down there.
than the federal government.
Yeah, I was about
Low
to
bar.
say, they're higher than the approval ratings that Congress has as an institution. So I think the idea that the public is going to just, this dark contingent of the public that hasn't been speaking up until this point, is just going to emerge from the hinterlands and say, yes, here's what we can. I think that's assuming a lot. If you look at most of the privacy surveys that have been done in a longitudinal manner over the last few decades, Alan Weston, you should look him up. He's done some great privacy surveys since the 1970s. The vast majority of people do not care that much about their privacy. They care about privacy as it relates to government surveillance. They care about privacy as it relates to the contextual nature of their relationships in their local community, with friends, with family, with the church, with people they interact with every day. But some distant corporation scooping up a bunch of information that the consumer wasn't going to use for any valuable purpose on his or her own, the companies all of a sudden get a hold of and use to offer you coupons at CVS. This isn't something that people have generally expressed any concern about. And Weston finds consistently that
only about 20 to 25% of the population can reasonably lumped into the basket of what he calls privacy fundamentalists, people who care so much about privacy that they're actually willing to pay money to keep information about themselves secure and out of the line of sight of corporations. So, public pressure, not that.
I think it also depends on what you mean by public pressure. I think that again, we're talking about privacy exists on such a spectrum in terms of those personal preferences and in terms of what information that you personally consider very near and dear and sensitive. That there have also been studies that show the kind of level of security and what we expect in terms of when we're talking about banking information versus where I went to lunch is a difference in that regard. So I think that because there is such a spectrum, what you will see is if more people are requesting certain options, you may see the market respond, be it the big players or be it new players emerge that offer a more niche product for that 25% of people that are more privacy sensitive. And in some ways those products already exist. And there are people that already use them, be they encrypted messaging devices or more privacy sensitive browsers as we were discussing earlier. So it's making that awareness as a consumer, but for a lot of consumers, it's just making minor changes.
Just 2 points. I can't let the congressional repeal of the FCC rules slide because I was at the Federal Trade Commission at the time, and I'd like to remind people that the reason the FCC had to adopt that rule is because they removed the FTC's jurisdiction to protect consumer privacy. And the way they adopted it was in a way that the FTC thought was not appropriate. And so I think that was a bad rule and it should have gone away. And the FTC is back on the beat there. But to your question about the privacy groundswell, I think Brian's right that consumers care about privacy in the abstract. And they care about it in very particular instances. But even European consumers, after GDPR was passed, there was a great poll that put like what they were concerned about in the upcoming elections. They put privacy at literally the bottom of their list of things. And so I think as a groundswell effort, I think it's becoming a label for other things. And if that's true, then companies like a general unease about big tech companies, and they call it privacy, then maybe there's more pressure. But I think as privacy, as the FTC or GDPR and CCPA define it, I think there's some interest in it, but I don't see a mass movement on it.
I'll make this my last question before we open up to the audience. Do we want to point out any particular companies that have been moving in this direction of greater privacy, less collection of data? Apple's the obvious one. And not everyone wants to take them up on that sales pitch if they don't own an iPhone because I have a headphone jack. Are there other ones we want to put forth, maybe ones where you've decided to give more of your business or your time to because the business model they lay out and their use of your data better matches what the world would like to see?
I would say when I make my choices between platforms, often it has less to do with the information they gather and more to do with all the basically try to go where people are the least annoying. And it's worse. No, it's hard. The challenge is here. It's one thing to have an argument with a random stranger on the internet. You can just let that go at night. But like when your aunt just keeps posting things that you're like, wow, that gets painful. And so so I think that's how I've made my choices. It's more to isolate myself from other people's information than it is to isolate my information from the company.
Yeah, I've made most of my recent decisions with that same framework in mind. So I'm actually not on Facebook anymore, not because I don't think Facebook has value, but because I just primarily wanted to use it as a newsfeed source, which I found Twitter was actually a much better option for. Because at least the offer list is condensed to 280 characters, and it scrolls by pretty quick, and you just tweet them. So that's a major plus in my mind. Facebook I'm not on it anymore for basically the exact same reasons that Neil just articulated. No less from family members and more the posts from friends and quasi associates. I don't use Mozilla Mozilla's Firefox myself because I'm big on Chrome. This isn't a pitch, by the way. I'm not getting paid to one way or another. But I do think Mozilla has sort of positioned itself as a privacy-conscious company in this day and age. And I don't know where they rank in terms of total browser subscribers and users, but they're in the top 5, and so I think it's indicative of a model that actually has some legs with certain demographics. How many people are using DuckDuckGo versus Google though? That's probably a much tougher hurdle to surmount. So personally, I don't make these decisions based primarily on data collection terms of use. I'm happy to share as much of my information as I can, especially I even share my health information as much as I can because I think it has positive spillover effects for society and research. But yeah, Mozilla seems like a big one in my mind. Apple kind of, but even they're experiencing a little bit of a privacy bump with their recent FaceTime kerfuffle, which I think tells an important story here, which is no matter how privacy conscious a company seems or tries to project itself, there's always going to be failures. There will always be failures, and we're not going to have a perfect 100% privacy tight bound service that's going to not make mistakes. So just worth bearing in mind that this world is not for production.
Similar to Neil, a lot of times with my personal choices, it comes down to what I wish to use a platform for, but I will also say that on a personal level, I enjoy targeted advertising, and I really enjoy when I leave something behind in my shopping cart and the store emails me a 20% off coupon because I left it behind. And that's my own personal preference. My mother, on the other hand, is probably the most privacy-conscious person I know and will opt out of every tracking. I think she's probably one of the few people I know that's actually clicked on the ad choices buttons and
Somebody actually did it.
I know, and runs an ad blocker and things like that because we have different preferences from each other. And I think the great thing about the current system is that it allows companies to respond to those different preferences, and it allows consumers to act on those different preferences.
Okay, so we've learned so far that annoying people on the internet is a big problem. We'll have to discuss that in a future panel. That most of the other folks behind this desk here think we should keep most of the current system. So I'm curious to see now, do we have a microphone set or are people just going to good? If you all are going to agree with that or not, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you for having us. My question is pretty broad, but how do you feel about the ubiquity of having to be yourself on the internet? Facebook requires driver's licenses to verify yourself if you lose your account. You're putting your birthday on everything now. How do you feel about that in general, and how will that expand?
I think I'm going to venture the thought that it's important for us to remember the value of identification in a modern society. So identification versus anonymity. It's a tough question because on the one hand, there's a big movement of individuals who actually want to have greater anonymity online. And that's sort of the expression of the most extreme privacy fundamentalist position, right? I never want anyone to know who I am in any context, no matter what the situation. That seems a little bit overblown to me. It's important to be able to identify people in certain contexts. We have social security numbers and driver's licenses so that we can be identified for perfectly legitimate purposes, for paying taxes, for someone suing you. It's legitimate, though it's not ideal. So I don't know how you put it in. Well, you're I put it in this direction because you're both lawyers. So obviously you sue people and you get sued all the time. So yeah, anonymity is tricky, right? I certainly wouldn't be a huge fan of everything being encrypted all the time, no matter what. But I think there's a balance to be struck, probably in greater in favor of encryption versus not. But for anonymity in general online, I think the balance we need to strike is balancing away from anonymity rather than towards it, as a general principle.
I'm actually okay with anonymity. The problem is when it's unaccountable, you go from pseudonym to pseudonym and no one knows that you're now at a different sock puppet account. Besides that, persistent pseudonyms can in fact be very well guarded spaces. As far as sites that want more of your data, remember, you don't have to give all of it. You know, if Facebook wants to know your religious leanings, your political views, you don't have to fill that stuff out. And I would say delete stuff you put up there already. Twitter would like to know my birthday, it doesn't have it. It doesn't seem to be holding me back that much on the site.
You're missing out on birthday tweets, though.
You know, Facebook, I get so much love from there every day of the year.
I do think, though, that the tradition of anonymous speech in America, and going back to the First Amendment rights that we have held dear, and what's a little bit different in the American approach to the European approach, is not something that has been a large part of this conversation, and possibly needs to be a larger part of the conversation as well.
You should absolutely be able to speak on Twitter as Devin Nunes's mom.
I would say, I won't touch that.
Actual lawsuit filed yesterday. It's
But the First Amendment point is great, but it's also really important to remember that's the difference between Facebook making a choice that we're not going to let people on there unless they identify themselves, and the government requiring that you identify yourself before you share information on a social media site. And so First Amendment plays in the latter one, it doesn't play in the former one. That's as it should be.
Who's got the next question?
Hi, Brendan Bordelon of National Journal. We've had a lot of discussion, I think rightly, about the tech platforms and how any federal bill is going to impact them, but obviously the impact's going to go beyond the tech industry. Retailers, I think, are the first ones to think of, but really it can impact any of the industries in the United States. I wonder if you guys could just sort of address that, how you guys expect the federal privacy bill might impact other aspects other than Facebook, Google. I guess a corollary to that. Any anticipation that finance or healthcare might be roped into this? I know that there's already sectoral protections, but I've heard discussions that they also might be part of this law.
Well, I think it ultimately depends on, I would guess it depends on two things. The first is how they would, in a hypothetical piece of federal legislation, how they can define personal and or sensitive information, right? If it's along the lines of the CCPA, then literally almost every piece of information is covered under sensitive or personal information. And then the second thing to consider is how they're actually defining what the covered entities are. So again, in the CCPA bill, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, someone up here, but it's something like 50,000 unique customers annually or something like that, which is what ropes in such a large breadth of industry. So any piece of federal legislation, assuming it actually includes those specific provisions, it isn't a pure federal mentioned bill, how the scope of its effect is ultimately dependent, I think, on those two definitions more than anything else.
Well, I think it's a great point because we often talk about the big tech companies, but tech is everywhere now. All of the retailers, for example, are using these tools to try to serve their customers better and to try to, improve logistics. And data and IT is a big factor towards productivity. And so we have to be. You're right. It's hard to figure out how you would draw a law that would target just one sector. And it's also problematic to think about why you need to do this. If we're going after big tech because we think they're the biggest privacy threat, that's one thing. If we're going after big tech because we just think they're the biggest political threat or something, that's a much bigger problem. And so, so my preference would be that a federal law treats similarly situated companies similarly. And I think that was one of the big complaints about the FCC's role, for example, in that it treated ISPs who were allegedly going to do the same practices as edge providers differently than edge providers were. And so I do think it makes sense to have a consistent standard that businesses can focus on. And that's why I'm a fan of the FTC's approach, in part because it's much easier to have a consistent standard when you're not focused on the business model, but you're focused on the outcomes. What are the outcomes to consumers? If the outcome is harm, financial harm, we don't care how you got there. We don't care how your business model got there. Let's address that harm. And so if you have a model that does that looks at the outcomes, I think it's much easier to have a law that's generally applicable to lots of different companies, but focuses on, in enforcement, on the ones who act badly.
And just following up what's already been said, I think it really is an important conversation to have, that if, depending on how it's drafted, this could impact particularly a lot of small businesses that happen to have online presence, whether it's a florist in California, or if it's a small ISP, or any of a variety of businesses that may or may not actually be focused on truly online activity. Data is increasingly a part of how businesses interact with their customers, and again, considering those trade-offs, do we lose the benefits for what we're possibly getting?
Okay, so I think I can sum up things as such. There are a couple of very broad laws out there in Europe and California that this panel has some issues with. There's an agreement that privacy is a mess, that there's real consumer harm. We don't actually know that Congress will do anything, and so we may have a patchwork of laws, and we may have to come back and do this a year from now. In conclusion, please clap.
Discussion. If we get the second panel to come up, please. Let me take this opportunity to thank Secretary Brown and Lindbergh for the later discussion and our expertise on antitrust and competition policies.
Not too shabby.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Let me introduce the panelists I have to my left here. Next to me is Caleb Watney. He is a technology and innovation fellow at the Arch Street Institute. His work focuses on emerging technologies, including autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, drones, and robotics. Before Arch Street, Caleb was a graduate research fellow at the Mercatus Center and a policy research consultant with the firm. Next, we have Ashley Baker. She is the director of public policy at the Committee for Justice. Her research focuses on technology and economic policy, as well as regulatory reform and constitutional law. Ashley has published her work with the Arch Street Institute, Freedom Works Foundation, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And finally, we have Will Reinhardt. Will is the director of technology and innovation policy at the American Action Forum. He specializes in telecommunications, internet, and data policy with a focus on emerging technologies and innovation. Will was previously a research fellow at Tech Freedom and the director of operations at the International Center for Law and Economics. So, for the most part, we'll be focusing on antitrust competition issues and how those kind of segment into AI, emerging technologies, Google, tech, these big tech platforms. But I think the most salient topic right now is how the 2020 Democratic election is shaping up to be focused on antitrust. I mean, we have Senator Warren coming out 2 Fridays ago with her big breakup of tech, a big breakup of Google, Facebook, all these tech platforms. We have Senator Klobuchar in her sub-speeches also proposing different measures. She wants to supercharge the DOJ and the FTC, the 2 antitrust agencies, by giving more funding. We have other candidates, John Hickenlooper making a few comments. We have, Bernie Sanders. So the biggest question I have for each of you is, with everyone coming to the forefront of 2020 debate with this antitrust bent, what is the issue that they are all trying to solve? Is it different issues? Is it competition issues? Is it monopoly issues? Is it privacy issues? Is that being lumped into this? Is there a common thread on this, or is every candidate kind of going at it in a different lens?
I think, as kind of the last panel helped illuminate, there are a lot of different issues that are baked into the tech issue. I think a lot of the focus on the big tech corporations, though, is also driven by sort of like the change in the environment. If you look at what are the 10 largest companies in the US 20 years ago to today, the biggest change is that a lot of the top ones now are tech companies. And people notice that, and certainly as there's kind of been an increased conversation in the US around economic concentration and inequality more generally, tech companies have kind of become part of the focus there. I think the other issue is as tech continues to eat more and more of the world, software is eating more of the world, people are seeing the effects of tech in their life in a more concrete way, and that kind of naturally begins to have a question, why is the status quo the way that it is?
I agree with Caleb particularly about how the biggest companies right now are tech companies, and that makes tech companies kind of the concern right now. I mean, 10 years ago, it was Wall Street and big banks, and that's what they wanted to break up, particularly Elizabeth Warren. And now that's kind of evolved into taking tech companies, and because this technology is so ubiquitous, I mean, you could argue even more so than banking really is, then it's kind of, it's kind of a convenient boogeyman, because, every day you do these things, you send emails, you're on your cell phone, just kind of highlighting the problems with what you do every 5 minutes of the day. It's really effective, if nothing else, as a campaign strategy. I think also a lot of these issues, as the last panel kind of discussed, are being lumped in together, like privacy and antitrust and some of the content moderation issues particularly, which is where I think it's actually particularly dangerous. I don't think you should use the power of the government to break up a company because you don't like what they're doing. And I think we're seeing a lot of that on both sides. The two sides would probably disagree with what they're doing that they don't like, but it's really kind of a mirror image in a way.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot here, and obviously I'd like to thank the panelists for being here and talking through some of these issues. I think the Warren piece that came out on Medium was actually very insightful and kind of highlighting some of the major areas that really seem to worry people. So one, there's at least this kind of implicit revenue share question. How, if the larger companies are having more and more share absolutely within their industries of the revenue. This is kind of like the traditional competition HHI question. Then there's another kind of subtle part of that as well, which is the innovation question. So, the fact that you have these larger companies, are they kind of taking away or at least not allowing other potentially innovative firms to grow? That at least is mentioned as well within Warren's piece on Medium. But the other thing, which I think is probably the most important, which is something that's far harder to define, is this question of power. So people often talk about big tech having power, these large platforms having power, Apple and Google and Facebook having power. That's a very tricky thing to figure out. What exactly does it mean? And how do you quote unquote solve that problem? To me, there's a lot to be said about the Warren plan. Hopefully, we can talk about it a little bit more. But the thing I think that is probably potentially could be passed within the Warren plan isn't, so everyone's talking about breaking up big tech and kind of separating out these two sides of the market. But there's another part of that plan which actually could pass, which is that there would be a mandate that all platforms have to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory with regards to their users. That's actually something that could, I think, very easily pass this Congress even. That you have basically a requirement, which you've seen in telecommunications, you've seen in airline, you've seen in trucking before, a requirement that all of the, that they have to deal with their users in this fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory fashion. Now this has occurred in other spaces. If you work in the FCC a lot, that this is actually, this pops up time and time again within the Communications Act. So while we're talking about, I think Warren is really, and others, Amy Klobuchar also has, and I don't know if she's reintroduced it for this Congress, but she mentioned, or did she reintroduce the Merger Act this Congress?
I don't think so, no.
Needless to say, there was that in 2018, which is you give, you make it much harder to, you go to the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, you make it much harder to merge, you lower the threshold of the kind of the size of businesses that you have to do merger review. So there are these kind of discussions, at least, of kind of changing around fundamentally the way that we go after, or that we can potentially kind of curtail some of these companies.
I think the only other thing I would add on this point is kind of like a practical, pragmatic standpoint where we are in the timeline of the 2020 campaign is we're entering into the primary. Candidates are trying to distinguish themselves from other candidates, And primaries are kind of a time for the party to try out new ideas that have kind of been bubbling through the media ecosystem for the last 2 years when you've been out of power, and you try to see how do these play with voters, and you get to discuss them. And with a large field like this, there's lots of candidates that are trying to differentiate themselves. I think the fact that Elizabeth Warren in particular brought this up is notable because I think she's not been doing as well in the polls as she would perhaps like. I think, last I saw she was around like 3% in the prediction markets or something. And so if you're trying to sort of get into a media bubble, try to see how your campaign would do on different issues, this is the time for testing out all those new big ideas.
I want to segue back to a point Will brought up. With Warren's proposal, with the breakup, how does that impact innovation? And one of the biggest critiques I've heard from kind of murmurs after her proposal came out is that, a lot of startups, Instagram, for example, which was acquired by Facebook a few years back, these startups, they look to be acquired by big tech, they look to be acquired by Facebook and Google. So if we kind of diminish that means for them to be acquired, does that instantly stall innovation? Does that kind of curtail their means to be acquired?
To an extent, yes. The question, it's really difficult. So the technical term for this is called an entry for buyout. There's some really good work that was done in the 80s and 90s when this was really becoming a big thing, is that you basically start a new company in order to get bought by a large firm. In fact, my brother runs a biomedical startup, and that's kind of their end result. They're not trying to go to market just because it's very, very difficult to go to market in the medical device space, which is where what they work in. So the end goal for them isn't to become, isn't to go through an IPO. It is really to get bought out by another large company. The question is whether or not those kind of opportunities really exist for tech companies to grow. This is something that I don't really know there's a lot of good research and really good understanding of actually what's going on. Some sites this kind of kill zone within technology, but at the same time, we're at 20 years now effectively. So this is 2019. So the real great kind of innovation within the ad tech market really happened around 1998, 2000. We're now at 20 years of a market. Is this the time at which we really should be seeing kind of a leveling off of innovation within kind of the platform space to a certain extent? I mean, when we talk about kind of the large ad-supported tech companies, I do think that it's tough to suss out what's going on here. In one regard, yeah, we kind of should expect the fact that it's kind of at the normal end of a normal market cycle. 20, 30 years is typically about how long it kind of takes to kind of solidify the market, and then something else changes. Now, of course, this is a big discussion of what else is potentially going to come in place. But at the same time, I think we have to be comfortable with the fact that perhaps this innovation cycle within this specific ad space, specifically within the ad space, perhaps has come to the end of its cycle, and that really we're not seeing kind of a destruction of innovation, but really just kind of what naturally happens within the development of an industry.
And an additional part of her proposal that I think kind of merits some attention that's not getting as much is the effect it would have on retail, particularly Amazon, which she's talked about a fair amount, but as Caleb just said, this is a time they're trying to test out different ideas for 2020 and some work and some don't. One that I think really did not work was last night Warren was campaigning, and I think it was Louisiana, and she had this hypothetical that was about a guy named Pete who had this business called Pete's Pet Pillows, and Pete went to Amazon to sell his pet pillows, and eventually Amazon, kind of wisened up and was like, oh, well, pet pillows, that's a great racket. We're going to make our own pet pillows, and suddenly his pet pillows are not listed, as high up in the search results as Amazon's pet pillows are. So therefore, she considers that anti-competitive behavior. It's kind of another instance in which people kind of freak out about things when it comes to the internet. But if you take that analogy and kind of reverse it to the physical world, so if you have a pet store, a local pet store, and usually an outside supplier provides your pet pillows that you're selling, and then you start making your own pet pillows, of course you're going to promote your own. So whenever you apply that, especially when you apply something from the digital world to the physical and it still doesn't make any sense, I think that's something really suspicious.
Getting back to the question of sort of would a prohibition on buying startups chill innovation, I think it's certainly hard to say that it wouldn't have any effect at all. I mean, I think if you think in the abstract, are the type of people that can run multi-billion-dollar platform companies the same sorts of people that are really good at coming up with discrete product innovations, it seems like you wouldn't initially think that those are the same people. And so if you have like a class of entrepreneur who's really good at coming up with some particular product innovation, they can test out a market for that on a small scale and then get bought out by a large company and scale that idea much, much faster and more efficiently than perhaps the small startup could, but we're trying to compete independently. You can take innovations and then bring them to a much larger market at a faster rate, basically faster innovation. And so, yeah, I don't think there's any inherent reason to think that, you know, stopping a one supply of possible exit for startups would not have a negative effect on innovation.
And Ashley, you brought up a good point with Warren's town hall yesterday, her pet pillow model. Pete's pet pillow, so that's a tongue twister. You know, when she pointed out that strategy, she said this was a model for why I want the big tech breakup. But it made me think, you know, the EU under Marguerite Vestager, she had the Google shopping case, which is where, you know, Google repositioned, you know, other advertisers' searches on the front page, and that led to abuse of dominance standard, which led to this, you know, multi-billion-dollar fine. So the EU was able to confront this type of power in a different way that didn't require breakup of Google. So is there any kind of, you know, with that kind of a, you know, platform, is there a way for the US to, you know, replicate what we're seeing in the EU doing, or is this big breakup that a lot of people are kind of getting up behind with more, and is that the only model that we see with candidates taking?
Well, I mean, the EU certainly did something about it, and, you know, they did break up Google because they don't have a Google to break up. And that's the problem. You know, getting to the root of the problem is, particularly with venture capital investments, kind of, you know, Caleb was pointing out, you know, it's harder for these startups to really scale, but it's like particularly hard if you don't have any investments. And a lot of these regulations, especially when it comes to privacy, but also the antitrust in Europe has really driven them out of the market. So, I mean, it might appear that they do things without breaking up, but in reality, they just have nothing to break up.
Just more fundamentally, that question of whether or not the United States would potentially go down that path of, you know, effectively the shopping case model. I actually do think that is a far more likely possibility that comes out of all of this than just about anything else. That in fact, what you again, you know, highlighting what kind of the second piece within Warren's plan, which is that, you know, instead of kind of dealing with, you know, structural breakup without dealing with this really kind of tricky, nuanced question of innovation, you just say, okay, we're just going to add another duty effectively, or another requirement on the platforms. And then because of that requirement, which, you know, is a free, you know, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory standard, you start effectively trying to suss out those cases. Now the shopping case is difficult, not to say the least. I mean, there's a lot of evidence on both sides of both sides of that case, and I really don't know if the EC did a particularly great job determining that. I guess the real interesting thing will be to see that, you know, there were some remedies that were applied to it. It'll be really interesting to see if there's anything fundamentally has changed in the time period since. And that's really, I think, will kind of be, you know, that will be really the most interesting part of this question, is whether or not the kind of non-shopping market within that, you know, the Google search supports actually will change things around. I mean, the big interesting kind of the big interesting change within at least shopping is clearly Amazon. Amazon searches, or at least you know, shopping searches typically happen on Amazon more, and have, you know, at least studies suggest that more and more people are going to Amazon first to do their shopping search, which is of course something that Google had mentioned even within their own case. They were getting, you know, more and more they were facing pressure, not necessarily from their own platform, but by another completely different platform. And again, I believe it was in the most recent, I think it was Q4, they actually said that their advertising, just generally their advertising price per click has gone down pretty precipitously because of competition from Amazon. It was something like a 30% dip, but I think it's actually quite significant in this space. The other thing to really, I'm not going to say this is an easy issue, because I just don't think this is an easy issue one way or another. One could imagine a world one actually could easily imagine this world where you effectively have to go in front of some sort of regulator to ensure that your entry into an industry is okay, which is kind of what the Klobuchar Merger Act had suggested, and some of the Warner plan had also suggested. And in many regards, having had an expertise, at least in telecommunications policy, this to me just is very similar to what happened with the breakup of AT&T. So, after AT&T was broken up, then there was this huge slew of requirements that were added on and attached to the company that effectively required that if it entered into a new market, it had to go effectively in front of a judge in order to determine whether or not it could, enter into that market. So it made like home alarms part of this huge long legal back and forth. And in fact, if you were a telecom lawyer in the 80s, home alarm systems was a major provider of or a major legal question. So to me, that's what's worrying about this, is that even if we do go down this route, you haven't actually had the conversation within Congress. You really just shoved it off into other agencies. You shoved it off to the FTC or the FCC, or even perhaps even the courts, which I know we'd like to get into as well. But you don't solve the really tough problem of figuring out whether or not these instances were in consumer benefit. You really just have made this just an arcane conversation for lawyers and regulatory specialists.
Going back to the sort of, would we see like a shopping case replicated in the US? I kind of make a broader point about kind of the comparative dynamics of the regulatory equilibriums in the US and in the EU. Because there are like fundamental like cultural drivers. Obviously, we talked about this a little bit in the previous panel. For historical reasons, there's a lot of countries in Europe that just have higher than average, preferences for regulation around competition and around privacy. But the kind of unfortunate side effect of that is you're seeing it's actually increasing dominance of like big U.S. tech platforms, relatively small startups. You've seen, post GDPR, it's been Google, Amazon, Facebook that have been increasing in their market share in European markets. And I think kind of this is a sad fact. You're seeing sort of the model almost become, if you want to start off in a very innovative, dynamic market, you come to the U.S., you expand, you explore here, and once you reach a certain level of scale and you can handle a certain level of regulatory compliance, then you expand into Europe as like a mature company, which is really sad because there's a bunch of really interesting companies and startup scene in Berlin, especially. But I'm not sure how much success they're going to have there.
And just to highlight that real quick, I mean, you've done a lot of good work in other spaces as well, in some of the autonomous vehicles work and in drones, that this also happens because the United States has its own sort of regulatory barriers in other spaces as well. That, for example, England has become a real innovative place for drones because of that. And weirdly enough, at least with healthcare data, China has become a really interesting space because of the regulatory structure in the United States. I guess that's part of the work that I know you've done really, really solidly over the last couple of years, which is that there is this kind of regulatory arbitrage that occurs, and we shouldn't expect it because companies are based here in the United States that they're going to continue to operate within this specific geographic market.
No, that's a great point. And yeah, that innovation arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage point that you brought up is a huge factor that we need to be thinking about. We can't just think of what would the ideal set of regulations be in a vacuum and then just apply them to the US. We have to constantly be thinking about, well, how does this affect the United States as a destination for innovation relative to all the other markets that they could go to? I think two really good examples of kind of this innovation arbitrage phenomenon. One, you see a lot of drone companies have been moving from the US to Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and they're doing a lot of their testing and early deployment there instead of the United States because their regulators have been a lot more experimental and open-minded than the FAA has. Similarly, when the FDA sent out a cease and desist letter to 23andMe, they were totally willing to uproot and go to the UK for a couple of years. That's kind of caused the FDA to revise their position. But yeah, it just goes to show that innovation is not this kind of static thing that we can just expect to stay in the United States or stay in Europe. It's this constantly moving dynamic force that kind of goes over borders to wherever it's most welcome.
I think some states, though, have kind of woken up to that, especially Arizona, for example. States that have regulatory sandboxes. Of course, like that can only go so far, especially if it needs federal approval. But I do hope that that phenomenon kind of spreads, outside of those 4 or 5 states that we have right now.
I wanted to touch on a point Ashley brought up earlier. We saw our last panel touch upon it too. Is that what I'm increasingly seeing is we have, for the most part, I would say antitrust is actually a bipartisan issue. We have people at different sides of the aisle kind of coming at it in a different way. Josh Hawley, for example, he was at CPAC a few weeks ago, ago and saying how Google, Facebook are suppressing conservative content, and that's one way for antitrust regulators to go after that. And we've seen a lot of critics saying that because these platforms are so big, they can, stump other people's content. We saw warrants, ads being pulled down from Facebook. Last week, Politico broke that news. And people are talking about privacy breaches, data breaches, and kind of lumping that antitrust regulators and the DOJ and the FTC, they should go after these issues through a breakup, through some antitrust modification. So are there any risks with this kind of one-size-fits-all approach, or should we go after these various issues in various different ways?
There absolutely are risks. And there's also a lot of misrepresentation, deliberate or not. For example, the Elizabeth Warren video was filtered out on Facebook by an algorithm, I assume, because it had the Facebook logo on it. So, years ago, when there were people promoting products on Facebook, they would have, the Facebook logo to kind of imply that Facebook is endorsing whatever it is they're saying. So whenever the algorithm goes through and looks at the videos and pictures, there are like a couple of things that we test for, and that'd be one of them. And it was also, we spent a relatively low amount of money on that campaign, so you kind of wonder, was that to test the, how Facebook reacts to things or test the ad? But anyway, I'm not going to get into all of that. No, I think the one-size-fits-all approach is really particularly dangerous. I think people on both the left and the right are very bad at tech companies. They don't know what they want to do about it, but they can all kind of decide the fact that antitrust is something that sounds legitimate that they can do about it, and they all kind of agree on that, and that makes it, particularly, like I said, dangerous, especially with the election season right now.
I think as further evidence for the fact that kind of antitrust is being seen as this, hammer that can fix all nails, you look at the case of, the recent Christchurch shooting in Australia. There was a bunch of criticism of social media platforms for not taking down this video quick enough. And then you saw people responding with, this is further evidence that they should be, broken up. And there's not even a clear theory of how that would actually solve it. If anything, you would think fragmenting the platform would lead to more existence of this video propagating and going everywhere. So yeah, you need to make sure that there's a very clear theory of how breaking up or taking antitrust action X, Y, or Z would fix the problems that you're actually wanting to fix. But kind of a broader issue, if you take a step back, is that for any number of these issues, antitrust should be kind of viewed as like a last stand solution. It's an incredibly high risk solution, especially as you're talking about issues of like innovation. So I kind of analogize it this way. Maybe Elizabeth Warren and her like are right, and you can break up Google and Facebook and you can get much faster innovation. But maybe you're wrong, and you've just broken up, the few companies that are producing the lion's share of innovation across the U.S. economy. So it's a really, you might kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. Like there's a very few number of companies that are producing productivity gains. There's increasing evidence that it's really happening on the technological frontier. And if you target specifically those companies that are producing the most innovation, you end up backfiring and killing a lot of U.S. innovation. So that's not saying that there's never room for antitrust action, but that we should think of it as kind of like a last resort. And I've detailed in some of my previous papers that I think we have lots of other lower risk possible solutions to increasing competition in the tech sphere.
I think, one interesting thing that you brought up with the Facebook and their pushback they've been getting with the New Zealand shooting, the airing of those videos. I saw an article recently with, them kind of defending themselves, saying that, for the most part, their AI technology caught the majority of those videos, and it's only a small snippet that, slipped through the cracks, and there are hundreds of thousands of those videos, and this is a technology they're working to perfect. So, you think this is a kind of over slap on the wrist, or is it because of buildup of so many other slip-ups that Facebook, this is a pile on?
Yeah, I think you've seen, definitely Facebook, they're not viewed very charitably by the media environment right now, perhaps rightfully so. They've had, lots of slip-ups, but, as you keep on applying the same sort of skepticism to each new issue, you're not giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I think actually the Elizabeth Warren issue is a good case where basically the situation was handled about as well as you would think. As Ashley alluded to, there was a very legitimate issue of using the Facebook logo in the advertising, and Facebook has a very clear policy that their algorithm is going to flag that. But it wasn't like the ad was permanently kept down. It was flagged. It was sent to a human moderator. The human moderator said, actually, this is okay, and sent it along. It's exactly how the system is supposed to operate, but instead it got flagged as this huge issue, and this is further evidence that Facebook is trying to censor Elizabeth Warren.
And I'd also add to that, Facebook actually removes like 89% of all terrorist content before anyone actually ever sees it. So their success rate with this is very high. I don't know what kind of went awry in that algorithm there, maybe the location, who knows. But that was kind of an exception.
When we talk about Facebook, when we talk about YouTube, we talk about these platforms, they're multi-sided businesses. Uber, for example, they serve both riders, drivers who want to make money, have an extra job in this gig economy, and they serve us, you and me, who need to get someplace else and want a quick ride instead of taking a taxi, for example. There's a lot of pushback if the antitrust laws are suitable enough to police these multi-sided businesses. The Amex decision that came out, last year specifically honed in on this issue, and in many ways has made it tougher for antitrust regulation to hone in on these multi-sided platforms. So what do you both think, all of you think about how, does there need to be new antitrust enforcement that specifically polices these multi-sided businesses?
So it's going to be interesting. So that, as you may or may not be aware, that currently the FTC is undergoing a series of hearings on this exact issue about multi-sided platforms. They're doing a lot of work on this just internally to figure out where they would like to position themselves. Amex to me is a kind of an interesting case because it really doesn't. There's a lot that Amex does, but there's also a lot that Amex does not. I would have hoped that it would have gone a little bit further because, in fact, a lot of the kind of the nomenclature that is referenced. I'll be very blunt. The nomenclature that is referenced within that Supreme Court case, and basically this case is about American Express and questions of whether or not if they're providing or increasing prices on one side of the market, whether or not that that effectively harmed everyone. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, and I've written a lot on this case as well. But effectively, where the Supreme Court came down is that what they bluntly said is that you have to look effectively at both sides of the market to see what the overall impact was. What's interesting about that case in particular, and having gone back through it, and maybe I missed something, but the question of the harm that's involved in a two-sided market, I don't know if it was correctly briefed by at that time the DOJ and the attorneys general. So just as a practical matter, I don't think that the right argument was actually brought in front of the Supreme Court from the attorneys general to figure out really whether or not this is. It's an interesting case in that it opens up this really new, interesting kind of questions regarding platforms. And the real big problem that you're seeing within platforms is that you have two sides effectively. You've got perhaps and potentially 3 or 4 sides depending on what market it is. But when you're talking about say Facebook and Google, you have advertisers on one side which are kind of related to demand for attention. And similarly, users are on the platform because they also have attention or demand for attention in the form of content. And so these kind of what are called demand interdependencies actually kind of change the competition question pretty fundamentally. The European Union in various courts has also kind of recognized this. Even within some of the shopping cases, you see a recognition of the importance of at least trying to figure out what's happening to the entirety of the platform. But these things I think are very present and will be continuing to be very, very present for at least the FTC and the FTC and what's going on in the courts. Whether or not that Congress actually needs to do anything to kind of change around that calculus, I think it really still remains to be seen because still at the end of the day we're talking about consumer harm. If we don't have a standard of consumer harm, if we want to supplement the standard of consumer harm, that's a whole different conversation, which I don't mind having, but that's a bit of a different sort of question within, or at least in front of the FTC, that could be done through law, which is again something that a number of senators have actually suggested. Now that being said, that could be a very different sort of conversation than what the FTC already has. I mean, I think that practically coming out of this, what the FTC potentially could get is probably, at least in a very, it's something that probably is bipartisan on both the Senate and the House, is, just more staff, just generally speaking. The ability to have, the FTC, the FCC, a lot of these agencies don't have the same kind of the numbers of staff that they've had since the 80s or even the 90s. And kind of the mix of the right kind of staff. Good evidence, at least about 10 years ago, and this has been changing, but at least the last time there was a really good survey of all these competition authorities around the world, the United States actually had the fewest amount of economists and technologists working at their their policing commission, which would be the FTC. So I could see at least a law that helps to change that around, and something that probably would be supported by both sides. But that, I think, is very much a different sort of conversation that we're having as compared to the stuff that we've been talking about here today, which isn't about the tools, but really, isn't about the efficacy of the agency itself as much as it is about expanding the overall tool set. And at least as a kind of a first order, problem, I would much rather say, yeah, let's try to give them the right set of the right mix of people and staff to actually do their current job, which is currently limited.
Yeah, I think building on what Will said, there is a real need for kind of the FTC to expand, their talent pool. They have a pretty broad authority through their unfair and deceptive practices clause that allows them to investigate and kind of make case-by-case decisions in a lot of these really gray area cases. You're also seeing the FTC is kind of looking at the uniqueness of some of these two-sided technological markets. They recently opened up a new task force specifically looking at sort of these big technology companies, and that seems appropriate. They're looking back at some of their previous cases like the Facebook Instagram merger review and saying kind of, after the case has been decided, now what can we learn from that? A couple years later, did the market evolve the way we thought it did? What should we know the next time we're kind of reviewing some of these cases? And that seems totally appropriate.
The Supreme Court is going to be deciding soon another major pivotal antitrust case, Apple versus Pepper. And Senator Klobuchar, kind of weighing in on this case and also weighing in on general, conservative change landscape of the Supreme Court. She said that in terms of antitrust solutions, don't look to the Supreme Court. Pretty much they are just further impinging what the antitrust regulators at DOJ and the FCC can do, and it's kind of to the detriment of how much muscle antitrust has. And other critics say that with Brett Kavanaugh taking the bench, and he'll be weighing in on Apple versus Pepper, this will further be a detriment to antitrust. What do you all make of these remarks? Is it correct to say the Supreme Court isn't capable of placing antitrust, and they're doing it at a detriment to consumers?
So, I would first point out that Congress can do something about antitrust. They can do it a lot faster than the Supreme Court really can. I know legislation moves at a very, very slow pace, but it takes even longer for a case to get to the Supreme Court. So saying that the Supreme Court is going to have this immediate detrimental effect when you're a senator and can do something as a member of Congress doesn't really make much sense. Second, as to, you asked about Apple v. Pepper or Kavanaugh specifically?
No, we can go to Apple versus Pepper. I know you've written on it. Kind of what do you expect the fallout to be? Illinois brick, the assumption that an indirect purchaser, you or me who purchase an app on the App Store, we can actually sue Apple now for monopoly practices. And as of right now, we can't do that because we didn't directly purchase through them. We purchased through the app developer. Kind of what fallout do you see that happening with the tech sector and other platforms that could be impacted by that?
Well, to kind of give the background on Apple v. Pepper, the case isn't really about whether Apple is a monopoly or engaged in monopolistic practices, really just who has standing to sue. Especially under the direct purchaser rule. The direct purchaser rule is from this case about 42 years ago, Illinois Brick versus Illinois, in which it was a manufacturing company selling bricks to a contractor, which was then selling it to the government. Working for the government. It was, are you allowed to sell if you're one step removed, or do you have to be the direct purchaser? And the direct purchaser rule essentially holds that you have to be the direct purchaser. And it doesn't really necessarily apply to technology that well. It's kind of all we have right now. In terms of moving the courts in one direction or the other on antitrust, it depends on what the fallout is. Based on oral arguments, which is, it's always hard to tell based just on oral arguments, especially considering the plaintiff brought a different argument than he brought to the Ninth Circuit. So it's kind of hard to gauge the justices' reaction. They all seem inclined to side with the plaintiff, in other words, not Apple. I think, the fallout of this is not really necessarily that bad. Because, even if users have standing to sue, that they then have to prove that Apple is engaging in monopolistic practices. And I don't think that will go very far. Plus, there are states that have Illinois brick repealer laws, so they can't do it, within those states. There are a lot of limitations there, And also, I don't know, so there are a couple of justices, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Alito, who pointed out, kind of hinted that Illinois BRIC should be overturned. I think there's pretty much no chance that will happen, just because the plaintiffs didn't ask the court to do that. That's not the question. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a concurrence or a dissent written by one of those two that's kind of asking future litigants to kind of bring forth that question.
You know, one question I do have, just going back to Apple versus Pepper, you know, in terms of if Apple is a monopoly, the big issues that were brought up is that they make all app developers put their apps at 99 cents increments, so 99 cents, $1.99. And that already is an upcharge, you know, what the app developer would want to do. And they also take a 30% commission. And Apple controls pretty much the entire app market. Is that alone a monopoly? I mean, you know, if Illinois BRIC is overturned and, you know, you and consumers can sue Apple, do we have enough of the case to say that Apple is a monopoly with those two facts laid out, that were laid out in oral arguments?
I mean, the Sherman Act is very broad in terms of that. I don't really have an answer to that. I'm not really sure. So that's kind of to be decided. If I were Apple in that case, I would be arguing that, you know, that money that isn't, you know, just a direct inflation, and that goes into, you know, maintaining the app store. Therefore, it's not just, you know, inflation of the prices. But I'm not sure the legal status of that.
I also wanted to go into, you know, Senator Klobuchar, South by Southwest, she brought this up. We have, you know, California's governor bringing this up, which is a data tax, a data dividend, so that you or me, we should get money from Facebook or Google if they profit off of our data. What do you guys make of these proposals? I mean, there's been so many of them, and they all have little tweaks to them, but they're also jumping into this antitrust conversation that big tech should be paying for everyone's use of data, but those services come to us for free, so what's the trade-off there?
Yeah, it seems like it's really just an effort to kind of capitalize on the political momentum against big technology firms rather than necessarily rooted in some sort of fear about externalities that consumers aren't benefiting from. Because the fact is, you know, consumers aren't just giving up their data and receiving nothing in return. They're receiving, you know, very valuable digital goods and services that, you know, if you look at a lot of consumer surveys and economic reports on willingness to pay, a lot of them gain a lot more value than they would if they were actually paying for the service out of pocket. And so there's like a very large amount of consumer surplus being created by this sort of digital trade for data, for services. And so, I mean, if you want to like tax bigness and then redistribute it, like you can do that in a more broad sense. You can, you know, impose a value-added tax or something and then redistribute it out to people if you're concerned about inequality, but trying to like specifically target the tech firms and tie it to big digital data dividend or something. I don't know, it seems like there's not a real clear case there.
Also, from a more practical standpoint, that's just not really enforceable. I mean, you have to, you know, put a value on data and decide how to tax it accordingly. So I just don't see how that would ever be implemented.
Yeah, this is an interesting idea to me, but one where I think it brings together a lot of the similar sorts of problems that we talk about. For example, when we talk about data property rights, that when we talk about data, we're actually talking about different classes of data. You have, you know, one class of data which we call like supplied data, which is the information that we send willingly to platforms, and that, you know, that can include, you know, in one instance, the kind of stuff that you the stuff that you clearly bring to the table, you know, like your, you know, where you're located, your gender, your age. Then there's also the other kind of stuff that you supply to the platform itself. Now, those are two different sorts of data concerns that are very different than the kind of data that you get from inference. So you know, you have a platform will take the data that, and even in between that, there's another potential set of data. So you've got, you know, I put information, for example, on Facebook. Somebody else clicks on that, on that, and so you have that kind of an interaction data. You take the data up that is supplied in addition to the data that is interact with, and that provides inference data that really is what is important most to advertisers, and the reason why they go to these websites is because they know, okay, these individuals, this group of individuals clicked on this specific ad, and therefore I'm going to pay X amount of dollars for that ad or that interaction. So there's a lot that's going on here that to me just really makes this a very, very complicated conversation, because it's like, okay, wait a second, you know, what is the data that's actually valued by advertisers? Well, the data that's actually really valued by advertisers is the inference data. It's the combination of the data about the individual as they interact on the platforms in concert with another ecosystem. So it's just a difficult thing to get at. We should actually, I've been thinking a lot about this, and hopefully, somewhat soon we'll be putting out something on this. But I would say that fundamentally the problem here is that and one example that I think is really, really good about this is actually Caesar's bankruptcy case. So, Caesar's the casino was going through a bankruptcy case, and clearly the most valued asset by far, which was almost $1 billion, was their data over the consumer benefits program, whatever it was, the real rewards program. So when they were going to sell it, they actually found that it would have been nearly impossible to sell it. The ombudsman, eventually the courts came in and said you can't sell it, but even at the time, the ombudsman who was going through there's now privacy ombudsmans for bankruptcy cases, interestingly enough. They went through and they said, yeah, even though it's worth about $1 billion, it's probably not going to actually sell because other companies that potentially would want to buy it are going to find it very, very, very difficult to integrate it and then build any sort of insights on top of it. The point is that even if you do have data, even if that data seems to be valued within a company as worthwhile, that to an outside source that isn't part of that kind of platform, it's almost a valueless proposition. Again, I've been thinking about this, and there's a real technical literature that's behind this. The kind of firms have been dealing with this, and the Supreme Court, actually, interestingly enough, has been dealing with this kind of, it's called specific asset question for quite some time. Needless to say, there's already literature that's behind there, and I've been trying to talk to people about it and say, well, if you're really interested about doing this, you really should be looking at this kind of other history that we already have of dealing with these very specific individual assets.
So would you push back against the catchphrase kind of dominating all these close conversation that data is the new oil?
Yes, and I was actually talking to a person who actually coined that in a conversation. It was in front of the Saudis, which is very, very important. So that's where that came from. Yeah, I mean, data is not oil. It's a renewable resource, and in that sense, that it's just like it just doesn't work. It's important. Not to say that it isn't important. It also has different sorts of value to different sorts of individuals. So oil is a commodity in the sense that it's valued everywhere. And again, there's a lot to be done in this space, but it's worth noting that there is clearly a very, very deep market for oil futures, for oil, for various versions of oil that just don't exist for data. There is not a really robust data market. And even when we talk about data brokers, we're talking about companies that are selling insights or inference data at its very core, and not just the raw information. And when you do get the raw information, you can look towards the black market for some of these prices. They're really cheap, but even in like even in the white market, they just don't command a lot of money because there's not really that much to be done with somebody's profile. Now, there will be, I think, a pretty concerted effort to get rid of some of the data brokers. And that is going to be a very interesting conversation, and one that is going to be ethically, at least I think, like when we're talking about data ethics, it's just going to be a very, very tough conversation to have.
Yeah, I think Will is right that sort of the key thing to know about data is that it's extremely context dependent and really only useful in a very narrow sense. If someone pulled up to your house with a giant trailer full of Amazon's full server set and all of their past data, it's really unclear what you would do with it or how you would monetize it unless you were just like ransoming it back to Amazon because it's most useful to them. You could maybe sell it to some of their competitors like Walmart, but they would only be willing to buy it like a fraction of the price because it's just simply not as useful outside of Amazon's very context-dependent systems than it would be to a competitor. I think the other area where kind of the data as oil thing falls off is there's really weird misconceptions around property rights. We like to take simple categories that we have and apply them to new things in the digital realm, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I sometimes like to use the analogy, imagine Nordstrom is trying to launch a new line of shirts that are all red, and so they hire people to go sit on the street and count everybody who's walking by in a red shirt and sort of notice characteristics about them. What age are they? What gender are they? Whatever. So that way they can better target their new line of red shirts. It would seem really unclear if you're trying to say, well, now Nordstrom has to pay everyone who walks by that street some digital dividend, because people have some weird I guess, a sense of property that doesn't really apply in this case.
You know, one question I've seen a lot of the antitrust regulators wrestle with is how, you know, how do we weigh data when it comes to mergers and acquisitions? So, you know, should there be a, you know, if Facebook wants to acquire another Instagram, another, you know, social media platform of some sort, should there be a threshold for how much data one company can own? You know, how does data play into the M&A space and how antitrust regulators really hone in on if small companies become a monopoly just because they own so much data?
I think that, yeah, it's difficult in the industries where there clearly are, when the market itself is data. I believe they actually stopped the merger between, and I forget the two firms, there were two data broker firms, they actually stopped, was it not Experian? I'm blanking on the case, but they actually stopped it because the market itself wasn't a market for insights based on data. In those instances, I think they've done a pretty good job. I mean, I think it's pretty actually a slam dunk case in that regard. It's something that I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to. But then when we're talking again about these very niche questions regarding data that is generated as part of another sort of process, that itself is a very difficult thing to do. And again, I would really highlight the work that's happening right now at the FTC hearings, because this is exactly what they're doing. They're trying to work through some of these problems. And again, full disclosure, we've been submitting and talking extensively to the commission on these issues. I would say, and again to continually highlight that this is really just it's a context dependent problem, and in many instances where this has become an issue for the companies within mergers or acquisitions, that this actually truly has, the FTC has pointed it out, but the problem is that it's just not it's a valuable asset, but it's just not all that value when it comes to outside sources. So it's very internal to companies.
Kind of last question I'll leave you all three with to kind of close out this panel is, this is coming March 30th, we're having a Democratic debate specific to monopolies, which, I can't really think of what an entire debate was focused on this one issue. A lot of it will have to do with rural monopoly issues, but you're going to have more in culture on this panel as well as Sanders. So is it correct to say, as I think Warren and others have suggested, that we're in another Gilded Age, we're in another age of Standard Oil, another age where we're going to see a big breakup of some sort? Or are we in such a high concentration of industries where it's reaching a boiling point?
I mean, I feel pretty skeptical that we're going to. I think sometimes the conversation around big tech generally can sometimes be skewed towards a few particular companies that people have negative feelings towards. I mean, if you look at surveys of Democrats and Republicans, in terms of trusted institutions, Amazon and Google in particular still rate very highly, and higher than the media, higher than the Senate, higher than a lot of the people that are running for these positions. In terms of how widely trusted they are. So I think sometimes there might be particular actors that then get conflated with the larger big tech category. But I think my overall message towards a lot of these Democrats that are having these conversations, and Republicans too, is again, you got to think about this in terms of risk. Antitrust is a very high risk strategy. We shouldn't turn towards that until we feel like we've exhausted all other options. And so just as a few examples of lower risk options, I think we should have an aggressive attack on the barriers to entry in developing new artificial intelligence and technology tools. So you're seeing talent acquisition is a huge barrier to entry that specifically affects small firms. International talent in particular is skewed towards large incumbents. You look at PhD STEM students, they are 45% more likely to say that they want to work at a startup or a small firm, but then in actuality are 50% more likely to end up working at the incumbent. And that's because of the complexity of the visa program. And so if you could simplify that visa process, you could unleash a whole pool of entrepreneurial talent that wants to work at small firms and startups and would help make the overall ecosystem more competitive. I think there's also things you can do on the data side. The government has a bunch of really useful data that has commercial applications that you could open up and provide more launching points for startups that want to compete against large incumbents. And then there's also issues on the sort of stability of international supply chains that also benefits big firms in terms of access to key hardware supply sets. And a lot of that's detailed in the paper that's in the back of this pamphlet?
So I'm very skeptical as well. For one reason, the first more related to elections and passing legislation. I think Congress's attention span on this issue is only going to be so long past the election. And also, ultimately, at the end of the day, they benefit from these platforms. So I think they do want them to stick around. Maybe some do want some sort of regulation, but I think ultimately they don't want these firms to be completely obliterated. And I think too is, in comparison to, you made the Gilded Age comparison, it's very important to look at it through the lens of it does help consumers. I mean, we're all better off that Google exists. I think it'd be very hard to argue, the opposite. And, the size of these companies and popularity is why they're so great. That's why, the Google search engine, works the way it does. So it's really hard, from a consumer point of view to say that these things are, these companies really harm consumers.
And just a kind of a final note about the Gilded Age. I mean, there's a lot to be said about that framing. It really does kind of remind us of the robber barons, and even kind of as a person from Illinois, names that particularly aren't talked about too much anymore. I would say that the three places or the three companies that actually Senator Warren highlighted are the three that tend to be typically highlighted in these cases, which is J.P. Morgan, which again has never had an antitrust case or a breakup case of any sort actually applied to it. Standard Oil, which indeed did have a very interesting and a very I don't want to say burdensome, but it was not an easy process to break up Standard Oil. That, but clearly what actually happened and what actually did change the market within oil was West Texas. It was Spindletop. It was the discovery of an entirely new output source, a new supplier, a new upstream supplier that actually truly did kind of change the market within the United States for oil. We talk about West Texas crude because of that, because of Spindletop. More importantly, I think the AT&T case. It came about because of a case that the DOJ was bringing against AT&T. AT&T became an actual regulated monopoly because of that. So the result wasn't, okay, we're going to break AT&T up. AT&T wasn't broken up until the 80s. What happened during the Gilded Age was that they were actually created and made into a more solidified monopoly. So there's a lot, even by our historical standards, there's a lot of different ways that this can go. And breaking up companies to me is really just not the best way of doing things. I mean, from a technical aspect, I think it's very, very, very difficult technically to separate out these companies. And then even more specifically, when we're talking about the industry itself, we're hitting a point, and it's going to be very interesting in the next 2 to 3 years, that the attention market, as it's called, is basically topped out, and a number of people who are actually working in the industry, and I love reading the difference between marketers in this space as compared to people who are working in the regulatory apparatuses. The marketers are talking about this kind of drop off that they're seeing pretty precipitously in their the effectiveness of their ads, of the amount of people that they're able to kind of the amount that that it's changed in the last 10 years. They're just not able to capture the kind of engagement that they used to. So these are actually more fundamental and structural problems regarding just the changing nature of our interactions with these tools that I think would be far more interesting to watch and potentially could be far more disruptive in the long term. But I do think that it is in part regulations coming.
One of the most interesting developments I saw, when Warren's proposal came out, is that the stocks of these big tech companies didn't noticeably drop. So the market reaction was that this is fluff with no muscle, pretty much. So we'll see how it plays out, and if it does, it's going to take years of legislation and lawyers working on this matter. So it'll be 10 years from now when we actually can see a breakup, and who knows what the new Facebook or Google actually is, if they actually survive 10 years from now.
Just a quick note on that. I think one reason you may have not seen the stocks drop is because the particulars of Warren's proposal was that basically they would be regulated as a public utility, which actually decreases the odds that their platform would then get competed out of the market by a different company. And so I did think that there was somewhat of a tension there between talking about the need to disrupt Google and Facebook, and then the realities of, well, it seems like we can't outcompete them, so let's just regulate them as a public utility, thus making it way less likely that they end up being replaced.
Do you have any questions from the audience? And could you please identify yourself before asking your question?
Hi, me again. Carlos Mercatus, data scientist out of Jackhouse, classmate of Will's out of Hopkins. How you doing?
Doing well.
So we kind of dodged this a lot with privacy and anonymity, etc. Kind of the crux of data being valuable is the interaction, like you said, and like being clicked on. So what are your opinions as kind of experts in this field on click farms, fake clicks, buying followers, etc., etc.? I mean, there's videos coming out of click farms in India and China that are insanely scaled. And what does that mean when we don't know if it's a real click?
So yeah, that's actually been a very serious problem that Facebook specifically has been dealing with. There was a time period where every January, it was like January 15th or something along the lines, right around mid-January, where Facebook would basically come out and say, yeah, we screwed up on these ad numbers and had to keep money back to people. There is currently a number of lawsuits actually with the advertisers currently in, I want to say, the Ninth Circuit on this question. So this kind of ad targeting is actually a very tough problem. Not to say, I mean, Facebook isn't the only one. I know there's been continual issues with this on YouTube as well. I mean, this really, it just is a problem. It's just absolutely, it's a problem that I don't think that there's any great way of solving it, because there's a lot within the market, or at least a lot within this ecosystem that it gives incentives to effectively have those click farms to sell that kind of information. I know that obviously a lot of platforms have been trying to trample that down, and a lot of it's coming to the marketers who themselves are looking at other potential opportunities. I mean, I know when I was in school, when I was working on some of this stuff, that there was this huge opportunity to go towards YouTube, because YouTube is just cheaper and it reached far more effective, and it was just better at reaching students, which is what we were trying to do. That, I think, is changing. Obviously, the marketers are looking for new opportunities, and that is its own sort of conversation. I think it would be very difficult, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think this is a solvable problem in any meaningful way.
Yeah, it's been an interesting question, in the broader scheme of content moderation over the past year. I do think platforms could do a better job at filtering out not things that are just clickbait, but things that are illegitimate content. Let's say it's one headline, you click on the link, and then it takes you to like something that tries to sell you like diet pills or something. That was one of the examples they had at Facebook. Some of those sorts of examples are what really kind of disincentivizes legitimate advertisers from using the platform. If I ran a small business and was going to take out an ad on Facebook, and I saw that other people who were somewhat in the same line of business were not doing this legitimately, why put your money there? And it's kind of a losing system on their end. So I think in order to build a platform that actually works for advertisers, we're going to have to do that more effectively.
I think some of what you're seeing is there's pretty cool techniques being developed in, say, like finance processing for distinguishing between like real and fraud users. And a lot of that's based on the metadata, but how are they moving their mouse? It's kind of similar to like recapture kind of technology, but kind of on a larger scale. Like actual human consumers have a lot of kind of patterns that you can track and see and use to distinguish between people that are trying to just inflate clicks in an artificial way and people that are actually buying or watching the ads. Now, of course, click farms or fraudsters can try to mimic that, and so there ends up being sort of like an arms race between the detection and the fraud companies. And I'm not sure kind of which way the equilibrium will go in the long run, but I do certainly think it'll become harder as you see a lot of these techniques start to propagate and become more advanced.
Any other questions?
Kurt Levy, Committee for Justice. I think I saw somewhere in the either description or title of this panel something about AI, and I was wondering do you think developments in AI will have an impact on developments in antitrust law? I don't have anything particular in mind, just kind of wondering your thoughts.
I mean, I think AI is certainly relevant to the current scope of antitrust discussions around big tech firms, just because AI is driving a larger and larger share of the business models of those, big companies. I'm not sure if there are, particular advances around AI that are super relevant to antitrust. I mean, you've seen, Margaret Vestager, I think, in the EU, talk about, the potential algorithmic collusion. And I think there's not like a lot of great examples of that. There probably needs to be more work on that. But I think most of the conversation around AI and antitrust is about how AI may drive concentration amongst the biggest firms.
And as I mentioned, I think that especially the stuff that Caleb has done on this, I think really highlights this issue, which is that when we do talk about AI, fundamentally we're also talking about really just kind of competition questions writ large. So in some ways, AI really is kind of this anti-domain that we're talking about, but it is really I think very much highlights what is really important about this, which is, again, it's having technology embedded in specific companies, having the talent is also important, so education, so all of these things just more fundamentally are really, really important to get AI into industries. And in fact, I've seen a lot of bills come up. There's the STEM Act bill that recently was introduced and was had bipartisan and passed the House, which would kind of reorient some National Science Foundation grants towards women and also towards just younger educational groups. So there is, I think, a very concerted effort to understand more holistically how we do better competition, and that just naturally implicates and really very intimately tied with the AI question. And when we're talking about AI, we're really just talking about really just broadly competition questions very large.
One other note I would just say, keep it in my mind again, is the fact that if you think about AI as just like the latest iteration of a general purpose technology that basically means that it can affect the entire economy, it itself can become part of the process for discovering new technologies, and hopefully it'll boost productivity growth in the long run. Eric Huddleston from MIT has a really good paper on sort of how do general purpose technologies diffuse across the economy, and he points out that there's sort of this lag time of 20, 30 years usually with the new general purpose technology, where the top companies in the frontier are the ones driving the largest innovations, but the business models and kind of the management philosophies of the rest of the companies in the economy haven't caught up to those. And so you might actually expect higher than average concentration during times when there's diffusion of a new general purpose technology. So perhaps that would lead us to just, as a good Bayesian, expect there to be higher than average industry competition during this particular time.
Yes, great paper. This is also, there's been a lot of really, really great work done on this. Paul Blair has kind of one of the seminal papers on this, and the general term you're looking for is called Ingalls pause. So there's this pause of 30 years before you had this boost in productivity, or not boost in productivity, but kind of boost in wages in other non-frontier spaces, which is kind of what we're in between right now. We're seeing, or potentially could see in the next 20 or 30 years, kind of a boost in in other industries as our generation gets, kind of supplants at various levels within kind of these industries and become, more subtle leaders.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Yaya Fanusi. Usually I don't ask a question. I usually will comment and give value to the panelists. What's an instance that I'm reading The Sentient Machine, the Coming Age of Artificial Intelligence by Amin Hussein. Please check it out.
Well, please join me in a round of applause for our